What's up guys, Tommy Bowyer here from Movie Rewind and welcome to the next instalment of the history of comic book films, and today we will be looking at the Dark Era from 1995 until 1998. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the Dark Era is a time in comic book films history when there was a series of flops. Now I'm not saying that some films released during this period were good, however the majority did not do well financially or critically, because at this time comic book films were kind of being seen as comedic again. However, it was even worse than that. They were just considered really bad films. It was just action fest, no one took them seriously, no one understood comic book films' potential at this time, and it really did damage the genre as a whole. It made studios scared of producing more comic book films. So it's a really bad time and a really turmoil time in the comic book film's history. So I'm just going to discuss a couple of the films which I think define the Dark Era for me. So the Dark Era really did start off in 1995 when Joel Schumacher directed Batman Forever. Now, Joel Schumacher has said that Batman Forever was more inclined with the Adam West TV show rather than a continuation of Tim Burton's Dark Universe. And that kind of makes sense because, of course, Joel Schumacher was brought in because parents were scared of Batman Returns. Even though it's a great film, they thought Tim Burton went way too dark, so Warner Bros. Were like, great, we need Joel Schumacher in, we need it a bit more lighthearted. And Batman Forever was lighthearted. I don't think it's a good film, and I think it shows that comic book films, studios were starting to get a little concerned about how dark comic book films were becoming, so they tried to bring it back, to the comedic style, more in the 60s like with Adam West, and the one which, is the high point of the Dark Era has to be Batman and Robin, released in 1997. That film is terrible. It's so cheesy and goofy and just trying to be a comedy, and it's not even as good as Adam West's Batman because that show didn't take itself seriously. Batman and Robin at some points is trying to make the audiences take it seriously. And I think that's what Joel Schumacher has apologised for this film. George Clooney has apologised for this film. Everyone has apologised for this film because Batman and Robin really is the pinnacle of the Dark Era, because it shows that studios just want, they just thought comic book films were just, if they had some extra money lying around, they'd invest in a comic book film. It was usually going to fail because they didn't really understand what styles to use anymore. They just thought everything has to be comedy, everything has to be cheesy. People expect over-the-top stuff from comic book films, which is not the case. So that's why you get flops during this era, such as Batman and Robin, because they were just seen as comedy and over-the-top, which is exactly why all of the comic book films released during this period failed at the box office. So I've talked about how DC were really struggling at this time and how they were affected by the Dark Era. However, Marvel was affected by the Dark Era as well. Marvel had never really had any success movie-wise. The majority of their films were flops. I mean, the first Iron Man film without Robert Downey Jr., Doctor Strange, even at least 3 Captain America films, each one failing, and one of them not even making it to cinemas, was just released on DVD. So at this time in the Dark Era, Marvel were really struggling financially. They were in and out of bankruptcy all the time, could never really get money to actually make any films with their properties. So what Marvel did, which would have a massive influence on ending the Dark Era, was beginning to sell off their assets. They sold Men in Black, they sold Spider-Man, they sold X-Men to different studios. And while these studios didn't really produce anything during the Dark Era, the work those studios would do with the properties which they got would soon create more comic book films which would end the Dark Era once and for all. So in conclusion, the Dark Hour for me is one of the most turbulent times in the history of comic book films. Because studios didn't really understand what to do with comic book films, they felt that what they wanted was just over-the-top action, over-the-top heroes with no real substance or storyline to them. And while I can understand their theory at the time, what we see looking back is just a legacy of flops which didn't amount to anything. DC really struggled during this period to release anything of substance, and their franchises which already had some merit, such as Superman franchise and the Batman franchise, began to fall because they just didn't understand what they were doing. As for Marvel, Marvel struggled financially throughout the Dark Era to put anything together. All of their films were flops. However, they started sending off their assets in order to save their businesses to different studios which were beginning to work on something to end this series of flops and start making comic book films not just a bad word, but a good word again. So thanks for watching, guys. I really do hope you enjoyed the Dark Era discussion I did. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe in order to receive great and maybe even improved quality content in the future. And there will be another installment out of the history of comic book films in a couple of weeks. I really have enjoyed doing this series. It's the first proper long series I've ever done, and I hope to continue that. And please remember to look out for, coming up this week is the Movie Rewind Summer Special 2019. Now, it is a bit different to the summer special I did last year. It's going to have a lot more sketches, a lot more beefcake than ever before, and I hope you guys support that and enjoy that, and I will see you in another one. See ya!